A verse-by-verse study in the Book of Acts, ESV, with Irv Risch, chapter 27. What does Acts chapter 27 mean? Paul is finally on his way to Rome. He has wanted to go for some time, Romans 1 verse 11, but a short visit to Jerusalem to check in with the apostles turned into a 2-year house arrest in Caesarea Maritima. He was falsely accused by the Sanhedrin. Roman governors wouldn't release him, because that would irritate the Jewish leaders, but wouldn't hand him over to the council because of his Roman citizenship. Ultimately, Paul appealed his case to Caesar. The text of the chapter alternates between Luke's detailed description of the sea voyage and Paul encouraging the people on board to make choices that won't kill them all. Acts 27 verses 1 to 8 records the calm part of this trip. Luke and Aristarchus have rejoined Paul. Paul, along with other prisoners, is under the watchful eye of Julius, a centurion. Luke records their voyage. They sail north from Caesarea to Sidon, where Julius allows Paul to visit friends. From Sidon, they curve around the northeast isthmus of Cyprus, and land in Myra on the southern coast of modern-day Turkey. Julius finds a grain ship in Myra that is sailing for Rome. On board, the prisoners and companions sail west, then south, and skim the southern coast of Crete until they reach the port of Fair Havens. In Acts 27 verses 9 to 12, Paul tries to warn Julius to stop for the winter. Paul is an experienced sea traveler. He's already been shipwrecked 3 times and left adrift at sea, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 25. He knows if they launch it will not go well for them. Unfortunately, Fair Havens is not a safe place for a ship to winter, and the ship's captain and pilot convince Julius to go on a little to Phoenix, which has 2 large, sheltered ports. Acts 27 verses 13 to 20 records the beginning of bad weather. Not only do the winds prevent the ship from landing at Phoenix, but they push it out into open water. The sailors haul up the lifeboat before it floods and sinks and use ropes to support the ship's hull. The winds drive the ship southwest toward an expanse of dangerous sandbars north of Libya. If they run aground, they will be too far from shore to swim. Attempting to raise the ship above the hazards, the crew throws out much of the cargo. They toss equipment into the water to try to slow the ship down. Both the crew and the passengers begin to lose hope. Acts 27 verses 21 to 26 returns the focus to Paul. He delivers a relatively gentle, "I told you so," but reassures them. Although the ship will be destroyed and the cargo lost, no one will die. He bases this on a promise given by an angel. Paul's divine promise is that he will face Caesar and that God will spare those who sail with him. In Acts 27 verses 27 to 32, the sailors realize they are near land. It's too dark to see, so they lower the aft anchors to keep the ship from running into any rocks. They then quietly lower the lifeboat into the water, planning to abandon the passengers. Paul notices and warns the centurion. The soldiers cut the ropes, and the lifeboat floats away. Paul takes control again in Acts 27 verses 33 to 38. No one has eaten in 14 days, and he encourages them to build up their strength. He takes the bread, gives thanks to God, breaks it, and passes it among the crew and passengers. Once everyone has eaten, they throw the remaining wheat overboard. In Acts 27 verses 39 to 44, the sailors find a sandy beach and try to reach it, but the ship gets stuck on a reef a ways from the shore. The soldiers plan to kill the prisoners to make sure none escape, but the centurion stops them. Those who can swim, do so. Those who don't, find planks from the quickly deteriorating ship and ride the waves to the shore. In Acts 28, the bedraggled survivors learn they are on the island of Malta, just south of Sicily. While collecting firewood, Paul is bit by an extremely venomous serpent but survives. The locals wonder if he's a god. Paul heals the father of the local leader, as well as many others, and the islanders treat Paul and his companions well. After 3 months, they catch another ship and land southeast of Rome. From there, they walk. Paul spends 2 years in Rome under house arrest, where he learns Jewish leaders in Rome are just as stubborn as any others he has met. He also writes the prison epistles, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Luke gives few details about Paul's stay in Rome, and the book ends with Paul's release. Chapter context: twice the Sanhedrin brought unfounded charges against Paul. In both cases, the ruling governor knew Paul was innocent but refused to let him go. Finally, Paul appealed his case to Caesar, Acts 24 verses 22 to 27, 25:1-12. He, Luke, Aristarchus, and 273 others sail for Rome. But they shipwreck on a reef off the island of Malta. When they finally reach Rome, Paul will meet with Jewish leaders and tell them how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah. Some will believe and some won't. This leads Paul to resolve, once again, to focus his efforts on the Gentiles, Acts 28. Verse by verse. Verse 1. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. After 2 years under house arrest in Caesarea Maritima for crimes he didn't commit, Paul appealed his case to Caesar, Acts 25 verses 6 to 12. He's now on his way to Rome, along with Luke and Aristarchus, Acts 27 verse 2. Aristarchus is apparently also a prisoner, Colossians 4 verse 10, it's unclear if Luke is, but there's no reason to think so, Colossians 4 verse 14. Later, Paul identifies Epaphras as his fellow prisoner, while Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke are depicted as free companions, Philemon 1 verses 23 to 24. Luke doesn't explain where he has been during Paul's incarceration. It's reasonable to assume he spent time in Caesarea caring for Paul and in Jerusalem gathering information for his gospel, which tradition says was sent from Caesarea. The Augustan cohorts were honored units made of auxiliary troops. Guarding prisoners was probably not Julius' primary responsibility. Centurions were commanders of about 100 troops and known for being steady, level-headed, and brave. Centurions in the New Testament have a good reputation. Jesus was impressed by the faith of a centurion who insisted Jesus could heal his servant from a distance, Matthew 8 verses 5 to 13. The centurion at the cross watched Jesus die, and said, "Truly this was the Son of God." Matthew 27 verse 54. The centurion Cornelius invited Peter to share the gospel with his house filled with Gentiles, Acts 10. Julius is kind to Paul and will, eventually, learn to trust him and even save his life, Acts 27:3, 30-32, 42-43. Context summary: Acts 27 verses 1-8 records the first leg of Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus's sea voyage to Rome. After 2 governors refused to give Paul justice, he appealed his case to Rome. The trio board at Caesarea Maritima under the custody of Julius, a centurion. After changing to a larger ship, the weather turns uncooperative in Myra and the winds blow the ship into a ferocious storm. Paul spends the voyage reassuring the passengers and encouraging the crew to make wise choices. They eventually crash on the island of Malta, the ship and cargo are destroyed, but everyone lives. Verse 2. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus are sailing from Caesarea Maritima to Rome. Paul is a prisoner in custody of a Roman centurion. Going overland would be safer but take much longer. On the Mediterranean, fog hides ships and clouds hide the stars. In the winter, fierce storms blow ships off course. Paul and his companions will have a very harrowing voyage. The ship is from Adramyttium, a port city in the province of Asia. This district is in the southwest part of modern-day Turkey. Adramyttium is opposite the island of Lesbos. The ship sails north from Caesarea to Sidon, where the centurion allows Paul's friends to care for him. When they re-embark, the ship sails around the northeast corner of the island of Cyprus and hugs the shores of Turkey until landing at Myra, Acts 27 verses 3-5. Aristarchus most likely has a much more colorful life than Luke records. He is a Jew and is apparently also a prisoner with Paul, Colossians 4 verses 10-11, at least for a little while, Philemon 1 verse 23. He is from Thessalonica, where Paul and Silas experienced a dangerous encounter with Jews who refused Jesus as their Messiah, Acts 17 verses 1-9. A couple of years after Thessalonica, idol makers feared for their livelihood because of Paul's growing church. They started a protest on behalf of their goddess Artemis. When the frenzied mob couldn't find Paul, they attacked Aristarchus, Acts 19 verse 29. Aristarchus came to Jerusalem with Paul to deliver support from his home church to the church in Jerusalem, Acts 20 verse 4. There's no account explaining why he would be a prisoner. Verse 3. The next day we put in at Sidon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. Paul is on his way to Rome, accompanied by Aristarchus, who apparently is also a prisoner, Colossians 4 verse 10, and Luke. They set off from Caesarea Maritima and sailed north up the coast to Sidon. Sidon is a Phoenician metropolis with a double harbor. It's about 70 miles, or 113 kilometers, north of Caesarea and 26 miles, or 42 kilometers, north of Tyre. It would be a straighter shot to Myra, Acts 27 verse 5, to go east, along the southern coast of Cyprus. However, the winds are from the northwest, and they need to skirt along the ranges of modern-day Asia Minor instead of risking more open water. On his way to Jerusalem, Paul stopped at Tyre and stayed for a week, Acts 21 verses 3-7. His friends may be from Tyre, not Sidon, or he may have traveled to Sidon while he built up the churches, Acts 15 verse 41. Julius is the Roman centurion in charge of the prisoners, Acts 27 verse 1. His treatment of Paul is consistent with the other Roman leaders. Although Governor Festus wrongly held Paul under house arrest for 2 years, he did allow Paul's friends to care for him, Acts 24 verses 23-27. The centurions in the Bible are all shown in a positive light. One had great faith in Jesus, Matthew 8 verses 5-13, one declared Jesus' deity, Matthew 27 verse 54, and one hosted the first conversion of a large group of Gentiles, Acts 10. Another kept Paul from being flogged, Acts 22 verses 25-26. Julius will grow to trust Paul and even save his life, Acts 27 verses 30-32, 42-43. Verse 4. And putting out to sea from there we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. Paul is on his way to Rome, a prisoner being transported to a higher court. He's completely innocent, and both Governor Festus and King Agrippa too know it. However, Paul has appealed his case to Caesar, so they must send him, Acts 26 verses 31-32. Aristarchus, a Jew from Thessalonica in Macedonia, is Paul's fellow prisoner, Colossians 4 verse 10, while Luke is traveling with them. The men boarded a ship in Caesarea Maritima, the Roman capital of the district, and are headed to Myra on the southern coast of modern-day Asia Minor, Acts 27 verses 1-2, 5. In Sidon, the centurion who guards the prisoners let Paul's friends tend to his needs, Acts 27 verse 3. Now they sail northwest toward northeast Cyprus. From Caesarea, Myra is directly northwest, but the strong winds would hit them straight on. It's easier to hug the shores of southern Asia Minor where the mountains can break up the winds. Under the lee, or under the shelter, NASB, NKJV, here means the eastern side. Cyprus also has a mountain range on its southern coast, but once clear the ship would be traveling headlong into those winds. When the ship gets to Myra, the centurion will find a ship headed to Rome. Before long, he will realize why it is much safer to travel over land. After a harrowing few weeks in fierce conditions and a shipwreck that completely destroys the ship, Paul and his companions will finally get to Rome. Verse 5. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. Luke seems to love geography, especially from the deck of a ship. The ship on which he, Paul, and Aristarchus are sailing has left Sidon on the coast of Phoenicia. They are now swinging around the land which juts out from the northeast coast of Cyprus, Acts 27 verses 1-4. Cilicia is the district on the southeast coast of modern-day Asia Minor. Paul's hometown of Tarsus is a major city in Cilicia, known for its philosophers and intellectuals. It's hard to say what Paul is thinking as he passes by it, a prisoner on his way to house arrest in Rome. Pamphylia is the district west of Cilicia. On Paul and Barnabas's first missionary journey, they sailed from Syrian Antioch to Cyprus, made their way west across the island, then sailed to Perga. In Perga, John Mark, Barnabas's cousin, abandoned them, Acts 13 verses 4-13. Paul and Barnabas eventually split up because of Paul's resentment toward Mark, Acts 15 verses 36-41, but by the end of Paul's incarceration in Rome they will have reconciled, Colossians 4 verse 10. Lycia is west of Pamphylia. The last time Paul sailed past it he was with a group of men from the churches around the Aegean Sea, including Aristarchus, who were bringing financial support from their churches to the church in Jerusalem, Acts 20 verse 4. If Paul hadn't gone with them, he wouldn't be in custody now, Acts 21 verses 17-36. Myra is an important port for the Roman Empire because it sits due north of Alexandria, the port that provides most of the grain for the 1.2 million residents of Rome. Myra's port is Andriache and sits 3.5 miles southwest of Myra proper. Centuries later, it will be the home of a bishop, Nicholas, who will become the Saint Nicholas, who inspired modern legends such as Sinterklaas, Father Christmas, and Santa Claus. The centurion who is guarding the prisoners on the ship, including Paul and Aristarchus, will find a ship from Alexandria in Myra setting sail for Rome, Acts 27 verse 6. The ship will meet with a violent storm and break up on a reef at Malta, but everyone on board will survive. Verse 6. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. Julius is a centurion of the Roman army. He has been tasked with bringing a group of prisoners from Caesarea Maritima to Rome. He boarded a ship in Caesarea which sailed north to Sidon. The ship then swung around the northeast corner of the island of Cyprus and hugged the shadow of the mountains on the southern coast of modern-day Turkey. They then landed in Myra. Myra is a good choice to find a ship to Rome. It sits directly north of Alexandria, Egypt, which is the major provider of grain for Rome. The average Alexandrian grain ship is up to 180 by 50 feet, or about 55 by 15 meters, in size. These vessels are about nearly as tall from the deck to the bottom of the hold as they are wide. At the time Luke writes this account, Rome has well over 1 million residents. The city consumes around 175,000 tons, or 160 million kilograms, of grain a year. Because of the importance of the cargo, grain ships often hire security. It may be Julius takes this vessel as part of a second job. Or, since centurions do not normally transport prisoners, this may be his original intent. Julius finds a suitable ship in Myra for his soldiers and his prisoners. Among the incarcerated are Paul and Aristarchus. Luke is traveling with them. After ignoring Paul's warning once, Julius learns to trust Paul. Because of that trust, though the sailors will lose their ship and all their cargo, Acts 27 verses 18-19, 38, 41, everyone will survive, Acts 27:22, 43-44. Verse 7. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Samone. Luke is describing the sea voyage from Caesarea Maritima to Rome. Paul is going there, as a prisoner, to to have his case tried before Caesar, Acts 25 verses 6 to 12. Aristarchus is also a prisoner, Colossians 4 verse 10. Luke is likely finishing his fact-finding tour for his second letter to Theophilus, Luke 1 verses 1 to 4, Acts 1 verses 1 to 2. The ship which sailed from Caesarea to Myra, on the southern coast of modern-day Asia Minor, was too small for open water. Paul's traveling group has found an Alexandrian ship, likely a large grain ship, capable of handling the Mediterranean, Acts 27 verse 6. The winds are from the northwest, and they manage to sail into them by weaving through the islands. One such island, Cnidus, would be a good port to spend the winter. It's not clear if the winds don't allow them to land or if they're trying to go on to Corinth. If they can cross the southern Aegean to Corinth, they can drag the ship across the isthmus connecting Achaia to the Greek mainland. After this, they might continue past the mountains of southern Greece before heading straight west to Italy. The winds don't allow them to travel any farther west than Cnidus, however, and they turn southwest to Crete. Samoni is on the northeast corner of Crete. Sailed under is from the Greek root word hypoplio. It means to sail close to the leeward side of something to get protection from the wind. When the winds are from the north, the lee side of Crete is the south where the mountain range provides smoother sailing along the southern coast. The ship only gets halfway down the coast, to Fair Havens, before they realize they're stuck. Winter is coming. Fair Havens port can't protect ships during winter storms, and to risk the open water is dangerous. Against Paul's warning, the ship's owner and pilot decide to continue west to the port of Phoenix. The winds change, however, and come from the northeast. The ship is blown toward Libya, forcing the crew to fight a storm that seems intent on running them aground on an underwater reef. This process is depicted in the remainder of the chapter. Verse 8. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Paul, Aristarchus, and Luke are on a ship headed for Rome. Paul and Aristarchus are prisoners in the custody of a Roman centurion who is taking them to trial in Caesar's court. Luke is along for the ride. They launched from the southwest coast of modern-day Turkey and are now hugging the southern coast of the island of Crete on the southern edge of the Aegean Sea. The winds have been against them the whole way, Acts 27 verses 1 to 7. The ship is likely an Alexandrian wheat ship. Rome requires around 175,000 tons, or about 160 million kilograms, of wheat each year. Most of this comes from Alexandria, Egypt. Wheat ships of Paul's era are up to 180 by 50 feet wide, or 55 by 15 meters, and almost as tall as they are wide. For reference, this is about the size of a large modern seagoing tugboat. Despite the winds, they reach Fair Havens just past Lasea about halfway along the coast. Lasea has a good harbor to winter in, but Fair Havens doesn't. It's unclear why they don't go back to Lasea. Paul tells the officers of the ship and the centurion they should winter in Fair Havens, regardless. The owner of the ship and his pilot convince the centurion it's too dangerous, they would be better continuing west to the port at Phoenix, Acts 27 verses 9 to 12. They never make it, Acts 27 verse 41. They barely leave the port before the nor'easters drive them toward Libya. They barely miss the shallow reef there before the winds drive them northwest where they wreck on the coast of Malta. The centurion does get his prisoners to Rome, by the grace of God, and learns to trust Paul along the way. Verse 9. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them. Paul was arrested for crimes he didn't commit, Acts 26 verses 31 to 32. When 2 years passed without justice, Paul appealed his case to Caesar, Acts 25 verses 6 to 12. It seems Aristarchus did the same, Colossians 4 verse 10. They're both in custody of a centurion who is charged with bringing them to trial in Rome. Luke is accompanying them, Acts 27 verse 1. Traveling from Caesarea Maritima to Rome is safer by land but faster by sea, if the weather cooperates. On their first leg, they hit contrary winds that forced them to detour around Cyprus. Now, they've been pushed farther south than they wished, to the southern shore of Crete. They find mooring in Fair Havens, just past Lasea. Lasea has a good, sheltered port where ships can sit out the winter storms. Fair Havens doesn't. Further on, Phoenix also has a winter port. Paul wants to stay where they are. The owner of the ship and the shipmaster want to go on to Phoenix, Acts 27 verses 10 to 12. The tense of the Greek word translated, advised, is imperfect. This implies something ongoing and incomplete. Paul isn't thoughtfully sharing his point of view, he's been nagging them. Ordinarily, it would be wise to do as the shipmaster says, but either the Holy Spirit is warning Paul or he's relying on extensive travel experience. He later specifies when God has spoken to him, Acts 27 verse 23, so this instance is likely just a gut feeling. Although the centurion sides with the owner and the pilot this time, he quickly learns to trust Paul, Acts 27 verses 30 to 32, 42 to 43. The fast is the Day of Atonement. The description given in the Mosaic Law says on the Day of Atonement, observants must afflict themselves, Leviticus 23 verse 27. The Jews interpret this to mean abstaining from food, although the law doesn't explicitly mention fasting. The Day of Atonement falls at the end of September or beginning of October. Storms in the Mediterranean start in mid-September. Scholars have worked through Luke's narrative, including the arrival of Governor Festus, Acts 24 verse 27, and determined that this is probably AD 59. The group left Caesarea in August or early September and didn't arrive at Rome until the following March. Context summary: Acts 27 verses 9 to 12 turns from the description of the sea voyage. Luke, Paul, and Aristarchus are taking to Paul's words of caution. The ship they boarded at Myra has seen nothing but contrary winds since they set sail. Now they're moored in Fair Havens, on the southern shore of Crete. Paul knows winter is coming and wants to stay where they are. The ship owner and pilot know this port isn't good shelter for winter and want to go on. The centurion chooses to trust the crew, he chooses poorly. Verse 10. Saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. A ship headed to Rome carries Paul, his captors, and his companions. The winds have pushed the ship south to the southern coast of Crete. They are currently moored in the port of Fair Havens. Despite its idyllic name, Fair Havens is not sheltered enough to ride out the storms that strike the Mediterranean every winter. Lasea, now behind them, is. It's not clear why the owner didn't stop there. Ahead of them and around a point is Phoenix, which is also suitable. The owner and the pilot want to go on to Phoenix. Paul has been pestering the ship's commanders to stay in Fair Havens, Acts 27 verse 9. Paul isn't thinking of a supernatural storm like the one that struck Jonah's ship, Jonah 1 verse 4. He has already been shipwrecked 3 times, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 25. His background experience tells him they're likely to lose cargo, ship, and lives. The owner and the shipmaster, however, know their ship. Phoenix is a good port, it makes sense to go there. The centurion decides to trust the owner and pilot instead of keeping the prisoners in Fair Havens, and the ship sets sail. It goes well for only part of a day before strong winds from the northeast drive them toward Libya and the hidden sandbars there. This sends them into a fierce storm that threatens to fulfill Paul's dire prediction, Acts 27 verses 13 to 20. But he no doubt prays. He apparently prays that God will grant him the lives of the crew and passengers, Acts 27 verse 24. Although they do lose the ship and all the cargo, no one is killed, Acts 27 verses 43 to 44. Verse 11. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Julius the centurion is a Roman army commander usually in command of about 100 legionaries, although the number in his specific unit is not listed. He is tasked with bringing Paul, Aristarchus, and some other prisoners to Rome for trial, Acts 27 verse 1. They traveled from Caesarea Maritima to the port of Myra on the southwest coast of modern-day Turkey. They then boarded an Alexandrian ship, likely exporting grain, headed to Rome. The centurion may be working a side job guarding the grain, Acts 27 verses 1 to 6. So far, the weather has not cooperated. Winds pushed them south when they wanted to sail west, and they're currently moored in fair havens on the southern coast of Crete, Acts 27 verse 8. They need to go northwest to Rome. However, winter storms are coming, and the winds are from the north. Fair Havens isn't outfitted to house massive grain ships. A little farther west, around a point, is Phoenix with two well-protected harbors. The owner plans to go on and the shipmaster agrees. Paul keeps interjecting into the conversation, telling them it's unsafe. Paul insists that if they leave Fair Havens they will lose the cargo, the ship, and all their lives, Acts 27 verses 9 to 10. The owner and pilot know if they stay, it will not go well for them either, Acts 27 verse 12. The centurion could take his prisoners and spend the winter in Fair Havens. If he did so, he'd have to find lodging and, if he is being paid to protect the cargo, he'd lose that job. In addition, he'd have to find another ship to take them to Rome in the spring. Instead, the centurion trusts the professional sailors. Phoenix is only about 40 miles, or 65 kilometers, away. If they can get less than half that far, they can hug the coastline the rest of the way. There, the mountains will protect them from the winds. It doesn't make sense to stay. Verse 12. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus are on an Alexandrian ship headed to Rome. When they set sail from Myra on the southwestern coast of modern-day Turkey, the strong winds pushed them south to the southern coast of Crete. Crete is a long, skinny island that runs east to west. Along most of its southern shore are mountain ranges that protect ships from northern winds. For some reason, the ship's owner and pilots sailed past the protected port of Lasea and went on to Fair Havens, Acts 27 verses 6 to 8. The storms are coming, and Fair Havens does not have sufficient shelter for the ship to moor for the winter. Phoenix, however, boasts two natural ports separated by a stubby, flat peninsula. Most importantly, it is protected by mountain ranges on the west, north, and east. It's an ideal place to stay for the winter and is only 40 miles, or 65 kilometers, to the west. Despite the short distance, getting there will not be easy. Just outside Fair Havens, the coastline turns sharply to the north. The mountains continue for only a brief stretch before opening into a flat plain perfectly shaped for funneling the northeast winds. The owner and pilot of the ship want to go to Phoenix. Paul has traveled extensively and knows if they are caught in bad weather, they could lose the ship, cargo, and all personnel on board, Acts 27 verse 10. The centurion sides with the owner and the pilot, Acts 27 verse 11. The ship sails west until it reaches the point and then turns northwest toward Phoenix. All goes well until it sails past the protective mountains. A strong northeast wind blows up and pushes the ship to the southwest. As the wind drives them toward the dangerous sandbar off the coast of Libya, the ship hits a violent storm, Acts 27 verses 13 to 15. If Jesus hadn't told Paul he will get to Rome, Acts 23 verse 11, he might be worried for his life. Verse 13. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. Paul and Aristarchus are on an Alexandrian ship, likely a grain ship, in the custody of Julius, a Roman centurion. They're headed to Rome to have their charges tried in Caesar's court. Luke is sailing with them, Acts 27:1-6. They moored at Fair Havens on the southern shore of Crete. The winter storms are starting, and they need to find a safe place to stay. The harbor at Fair Havens isn't sufficient. For some reason, they don't backtrack to the harbor at Lasea. Instead, the ship's owner and pilot decide to go on to Phoenix, and the centurion agrees, despite Paul's warning that if they leave, they could lose everything, Acts 27:8-12. The southern coastline of Crete is largely lined by mountain ranges which shield ships from the northern winds. The winds have been from the north or northwest. About 3 miles west of Fair Havens, the east-west coastline suddenly turns north. The southern winds are welcome. When the ship rounds the point, the pilot is able to steer them straight for Phoenix. This lasts for only a short while. Not long after the point, the mountains disappear into a flat plain. As they pass this area, winds shift and come from the northeast. The low hills in the center of the island are flanked by 2 high ranges that perfectly funnel the winds onto the plain and straight to the ship. The ship turns suddenly as the winds drive it toward the sandbar off the coast of Libya. Then the ship and passengers are driven into the storm, Acts 27:14-20. Julius already respected Paul, Acts 27:3, now he realizes Paul knows what he's talking about when it comes to travel. From this point forward he takes Paul's advice and, although the ship and cargo are lost, everyone survives. Context summary: Acts 27:13-20 switches Luke's narrative back from Paul to the sea voyage. Paul, Aristarchus, and Luke are on a ship for Rome, but the winds keep pushing them south. They've reached a harbor to wait out the winter and Paul wants to stay. The crew refuses. They set sail and promptly hit a powerful wind which pushes them into a typhoon-like winter storm. The sailors do what they can to stay afloat, but the storm rages for days. The passengers and crew lose hope, but Paul doesn't, Acts 23:11. Verse 14. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. It's hard to imagine what's going through the mind of the Alexandrian ship's owner. He had been in Myra on the southwest coast of Turkey, likely with wheat destined for Rome. A centurion appeared with several soldiers and prisoners asking for passage. It was a good deal, he'd get a bonus for the passengers plus soldiers to protect his cargo. The winds were strong out of the northwest, but they made it to the south side of Crete and moored at Fair Havens, Acts 27:6-8. Before long, they all realized it was too late in the year to go any farther because of the winter storms. But they couldn't stay in Fair Havens because their harbor wasn't suited for the rough weather. The owner, the shipmaster, and the centurion all agreed to try to go on to Phoenix, which had 2 suitable harbors in the wind shadow of a tall mountain range, Acts 27:11-12. Especially irritating to the ship owner must have been that Paul, one of the prisoners, kept harassing him. The man insisted if the ship owner left Fair Havens he was going to lose everything, possibly even all the lives on the ship, Acts 27:10. This prisoner had traveled extensively, but he wasn't a sailor. Why was he so adamant? About 3 miles west of Fair Havens, the ship rounds the point and starts northwest for Phoenix. They catch a gentle south wind that should take them in easily, Acts 27:13. Then they reach the one part of the southern coast that isn't protected by mountains right as the winds shift and start coming in from the northeast. The winds catch the flat northern coast, funnel through the valley between the 2 central mountain ranges, and roar across the central plains right into the ship. The pilot tries to turn the ship to face the winds head-on, but it's too late. They can't let the winds hit from the side or risk capsizing. They turn to put the wind at their backs and let it drive them on, right toward the giant underwater sandbar off the Libyan coast. Tempestuous is the Greek word typhonikos. It is a derivative of the same root word that is the source of the English typhoon. Verse 15. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus are on a runaway ship. Paul and Aristarchus are on their way to Rome to face charges in Caesar's court. Luke is accompanying them, Acts 25 verse 11, 27 verse 1, Colossians 4 verse 10. They're on a ship, likely exporting grain, with 273 other crew members and passengers, including a centurion and several soldiers, Acts 27 verses 6 and 37. The ship had been moored at Fair Havens on the southern coast of Crete. Winter is coming, and no one wants to risk the fierce Mediterranean storms in open water. The ship's owner and pilot want to go farther west to Phoenix. Paul knows better. He warns them, even though Fair Havens is not suitable to wait out the storms, if they leave they'll lose everything. The centurion trusts the owner, and they weigh anchor, Acts 27 verses 8 to 12. At first the winds are favorable and they're able to sail straight for Phoenix. As soon as they pass the protective shelter of the mountain ranges, however, the wind shifts from the south to the northeast. The sailors try to turn the ship to face the wind, but they're too late. They put the wind at their backs and let it drive them along, Acts 27 verses 13 to 14. In the next few days, they'll reinforce the hull, throw out the tackle and some of the cargo, and lose all hope. Paul will pray. He warned the owner that if they left Fair Havens they'll lose the ship, the cargo, and their lives. Now, he apparently prays that the Holy Spirit will at least save the men. The storm tosses the south, where they just miss the sandbars off the coast of Libya, and then northwest, where they wreck of Malta. The ship and cargo are taken by the sea, but every person survives. Verse 16. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. An Alexandrian ship, likely exporting grain, is on its way to Rome, carrying Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus. But after making it to Fair Havens on the southern shore of Crete, the crew realized they needed to find a place to stay for the winter. Fair Havens isn't suitable. The ship's owner and pilot decided to try for Phoenix, about 40 miles, or 64 kilometers, to the west. Paul warned them it was a bad idea. They left Fair Havens, sailed west, rounded a point, and headed straight for Phoenix. As soon as the terrain turned flat, however, the winds changed. A tempestuous nor'easter caught them, Acts 27 verse 14, and drove them southwest toward Cauda. Cauda is a small island south of Phoenix, today it's called Gavdos. The hills aren't nearly as high as on Crete, but it protects the ship just enough to allow the crew to prepare for what is to come. The ship's boat is a skiff used to take passengers to shore if there's no deep port. It's usually tied behind the ship and dragged along, but by this time the wind and waves probably either capsized it or filled it with water. Once the skiff is secured, the sailors reinforce the ship by stringing ropes under the hull. They quickly realize they're headed for the Syrtis, a gulf near Libya well known for hidden shoals. These shallow sandbars can strand a ship far from the shore. The shallower the ship sits in the water, the more likely they'll clear the shoals. To lighten the ship and raise the keel, the crew throws some cargo into the sea. To try to slow down, they lower the sails to the deck and toss some of the ship's tackle overboard, probably to act as a sea anchor. Despite their precautions, the crew knows it's not going to be enough and abandon hope of surviving, Acts 27 verses 17 to 20. Verse 17. After hoisting it up, they use supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Jesus told Paul he would get to Rome, Acts 23 verse 11. If not for that fact, Paul might be very concerned right now. Against Paul's advice, the owner and pilot of the ship he's currently on left the relative safety of the port of Fair Havens. They were attempting to reach a better harbor in which to spend the winter. The weather cooperated until the winds shifted just as they reached the unsheltered part of the island. The sailors realize there's no use fighting, and let the wind drive them, Acts 27 verses 9 to 15. In a short break on the lee side of the small island of Cauda, the sailors have just enough time to pull up the lifeboat and support the hull. The lifeboat had been dragged behind the ship in heavy waves and tempestuous winds, Acts 27 verse 14, for the last 20 miles. It's probably either upside down or filled with water, and the sailors have a difficult time pulling it on board, Acts 27 verse 16. They then string ropes under the hull to reinforce the structure against the heavy waves. The wind is from the northeast and it's driving them to the southwest. They all know what that means. Off the coast of Libya is the Gulf of Sirtis, a large expanse of water filled with shoals and sandbars, like quicksand with crosscurrents. The ship can easily run aground far from the shore. Luke doesn't specify what the gear is or what they're doing with it. They may be lowering the sails to the deck, or they may be throwing some of the sails, rigging, tackle, and/or storm anchor into the water in an attempt to slow them down. Paul knows that God will see him to Rome, but he doesn't have the same assurance for the other 275 crew members and passengers. He apparently prays that God will grant them their lives, which he does, Acts 27 verses 24 and 44. Verse 18. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. Winter storms on the Mediterranean are fierce. Still, it's unlikely the crew had seen anything this extreme. Paul warned them not to leave Fair Havens on the south coast of Crete. Yet, since Fair Havens's port isn't sufficient to winter in, the ship's owner and pilot decided to try to get to Phoenix, just to the west, Acts 27 verses 9 to 12. They were less than halfway to Phoenix before winds shifted, blowing them southwest, away from shelter. Near the island of Cauda, they managed to bring in the lifeboat, which was dragging behind, and use ropes to stiffen the hull, Acts 27 verses 13 to 17. The winds keep driving them toward the Gulf of Sirtis, a large area filled with shallow shoals and sandbars. The wind is ferocious, the waves are fierce. They need to stay high to avoid the shoals, but not too high or they'll capsize. The ship is an Alexandrian ship, most likely hired to bring wheat from Alexandria, Egypt, to Rome. The 1.2 million people of Rome use hundreds of thousands of tons of grain a year. It's unclear what the cargo is, however. They won't dump the wheat until they absolutely have no other options, Acts 27 verse 38. Verse 19. And on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Paul, Luke, Aristarchus, and 273 others, Acts 27 verse 37, are facing the prospect of drowning in a typhoon-like storm in the Mediterranean. The wind is driving them toward the coast of Libya. Between them and land is the Gulf of Sirtis, a wide area riddled with shoals and sandbars. The sailors have managed to drag up the lifeboat, reinforce the hull with ropes, and throw some of the cargo overboard. But they need to raise the ship even more or they'll run aground, so they toss the tackle, Acts 27 verses 14 to 18. Luke is not specific here as to what the sailors are doing. They have already lowered the gear, Acts 27 verse 17, but Luke didn't explain that either. Some think they lowered the sails and rigging. Other scholars think they threw the rigging into the water to act like a storm anchor to slow them down. They don't throw everything over, later they will raise the foresail, Acts 27 verse 40. With their own hands suggests they manually remove the main spar and throw it into the water. The crew and passengers will face the storm for 2 weeks. Passengers usually live on the deck and bring their own food, but no one will feel like eating. Everyone loses hope except Paul, he apparently prays. Because of his petition, God lets the storm take the ship and cargo, but every person survives, Acts 27:20, 22-25, 27, 33-34. Verse 20. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Luke, Paul, and Aristarchus are on a ship. They are traveling along with the ship's owner and crew, a centurion, several soldiers, and enough passengers to add up to 276 people. They tried to make for a harbor sheltered enough to spend the winter, but shifting winds blew them into a full-force gale, Acts 27:6, 12-15, 37. They think they're headed for the Gulf of Sirtis off the coast of Libya, but they can't see the sun or stars to give them an idea of their direction. Magnetic compasses won't be invented, by China, for another 800 years. The Gulf is well known for shallow sandbars that trap ships far from shore. If they get stuck, the waves will tear the ship apart, and everyone on board will drown in the maelstrom. The sailors have already thrown the rigging and some of the cargo overboard. There's not much else they can do, Acts 27:16-19. Luke's account of the sea voyage alternates between the details of the journey and Paul's responses. The time is ripe for Paul to act. He told the captain and pilot not to leave Fair Havens, but when the centurion dismissed his suggestion, there was nothing else Paul could do, Acts 27:9-11. Before they left, he told them choosing to leave would probably cost them the ship, the cargo, and all the lives on board. In the next verse, Paul steps up, gives them an "I told you so," and then gives them hope, Acts 27:21-26. Paul has apparently been praying. An angel appears to him and says, "God has granted you all those who sail with you," Acts 27:24. They will lose the ship and cargo, but not before the winds shift again and drive them closer to Rome. The centurion starts trusting Paul's judgment. Before they reach land, the military commander will even save Paul's life, Acts 27:30-32, 42-43. Verse 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss." Paul is on a ship supposedly headed to Rome. The ship left Myra on the southwest coast of modern-day Asia Minor and was promptly blown off course. They managed to reach Fair Havens, a port on the southern coast of Crete, just as the winter storms began. Paul told the ship owner and pilot to stay there. Presumably his extensive travel experience warned him they would very likely lose the ship, the cargo, and everyone on board if they risked moving. The sailors knew the harbor they'd reached wasn't good to stay the winter. Instead, they resolved to make for Phoenix, a little farther west. But the winds shifted and drove them into a storm very close to the sandbars off the coast of Libya, Acts 27:6-17. Paul's "I told you so" may sound petty, but it's purposeful. He's reminding them that he was right once before, so they will listen to what he says next. He's apparently been praying, and the Holy Spirit has promised that no one will die, Acts 27:22-24. He was right about the danger of leaving Crete. They need to believe him now. The text isn't clear why no one has eaten, but it's likely a combination of seasickness and the impossibility of preparing food in the middle of a typhoon, Acts 27:14. Beyond waves and wind, supplies may have gotten wet with sea water or destroyed by the violent waves. Passengers typically stayed on the deck and were responsible for their own food. It's hard to imagine anyone has anything left that isn't soaked with sea water. On day 14, they will eat a little wheat from the cargo but then throw the rest overboard, Acts 27:35-38. We don't know if anyone is injured. Luke likely would have said so if there were any notable casualties. The loss includes the time as well as some of the cargo and the ship's tackle, Acts 27:18-19. Context summary: Acts 27:21-26 again shifts attention to Paul. He, Luke, and Aristarchus are on a grain ship in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. They're supposed to be on their way to Rome. Winter winds blew them off course and a fierce storm threatened to push them to a dangerous series of underwater reefs near Africa. At first, Paul thought they all might die. But he has prayed for the lives of the sailors, soldiers, and passengers on board, and God has promised that although the ship and cargo will be lost, everyone will survive. Verse 22. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Several days before, the ship Paul is on left Myra on the southern coast of modern-day Turkey. It headed west toward Rome. By the island Cnidus, however, it was caught in a strong wind from the north that pushed it south to the eastern coast of Crete. The men on board sailed halfway along the southern coast to Fair Havens. In Fair Havens, Paul warned the ship's owner and pilot. Winter is coming. If they leave, they will lose their ship, their cargo, and the lives on board. The owner and pilot knew Fair Havens wasn't a good place to spend the winter. They decided to go farther west to Phoenix, which has 2 well-sheltered harbors. But as soon as they left the protection of the mountain ranges, the same wind sent them toward the Libyan sandbars and a typhoon-grade storm, Acts 27 verses 6 to 17. The text doesn't say exactly why Paul thought everyone would die. This was probably because of his experience as a traveler, including 3 shipwrecks, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 25. Since they left Fair Havens, he has apparently been praying for the lives of the 276 crew members and passengers, and God has answered his prayer. An angel arrived and reiterated the promise that Paul would testify to Jesus' offer of salvation in Rome, Acts 23 verse 11. In addition, God promised all lives on board would be spared, Acts 27 verses 23 to 24. God fulfills his promise. A wind comes from the southeast and blows them to the island of Malta, just south of Sicily. They throw all the cargo overboard and the ship hits a reef and breaks apart. But everyone lives, Acts 27 verses 39 to 44. Verse 23. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. Paul is encouraging his 275 fellow crew members and passengers, Acts 27 verse 37, all of whom are convinced they're going to die in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Their ship is enveloped by a storm so strong they haven't seen the sun in days. Nearby is the Syrtis, a large gulf riddled with hidden reefs. The crew has already tossed some of the cargo and ship's tackle into the water to try to raise the ship higher in the water and slow it down, Acts 27 verses 17 to 20. Paul had told the ship's captain and pilot that if they left the protection of Crete they would lose the ship, the cargo, and their lives, Acts 27 verses 9 to 10. Paul has apparently spent the past few days praying that his prediction, presumably based on extensive first-hand experience, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 25, would not come true. In response, God sends an angel to let him know, the ship and cargo will be lost, but not the lives of the people, Acts 27 verse 24. Jonah can be considered a foil for Paul, Jonah 1. Jonah was a passenger on a ship in a fierce storm in the Mediterranean, Jonah 1 verse 4, Paul is, 2. Jonah was running from God's call on his life to warn his nation's enemies to repent or face destruction, Jonah 1 verses 1 to 3, Paul is running toward God's call to warn his nation's enemies to repent or face eternal destruction, Acts 23 verse 11. Jonah saved lives by insisting the crew throw him overboard so the storm would stop, Jonah 1 verse 12. Paul saves lives by warning the centurion that the crew is about to go overboard and abandon them, Acts 27 verses 30 to 32. Jonah was safely spit up by a whale, Jonah 2 verse 10. Paul is spit up by the storm, along with all the other survivors, Acts 27 verses 43 to 44. Both faced many hardships on their way to fulfilling God's call on their lives. The main difference is that Paul did so willingly. Verse 24. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. The ship's captain and pilot were warned, by Paul, that if they left Fair Havens in Crete they would lose their ship, cargo, and lives, Acts 27 verse 10. The text doesn't say how Paul knew this. He is well-traveled, having crossed the Aegean Sea multiple times. And he's had at least 3 shipwrecks and spent a night and day adrift in the sea, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 25. It's likely he spoke from experience. Even so, he knew he would not die. God had promised him 2 years before he would get to Rome, Acts 23 verse 11. Now, several days in the belly of a storm that hides sun and stars, Paul reassures the other 275 crew members and passengers they will live, Acts 27 verses 21 and 37. Apparently, he's been praying for their lives, and an angel has appeared to give him God's answer, Acts 27 verses 22 to 23. Even though God promises no one will die, people still need to act. First, when the crew tries to sneak off in the lifeboat, Paul warns the centurion, and the soldiers cut the ropes, Acts 27 verses 30 to 32. Then Paul gets everyone to eat so they have the strength to throw the grain overboard and swim to shore, Acts 27 verse 33. When the ship crashes on the reef on the shores of Malta and the soldiers want to kill the prisoners, the centurion stops them. Eventually, as the boat breaks up around them, they all reach safety, whether by swimming or grabbing planks, Acts 27 verses 42 to 44. Verse 25. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. Paul has spent the last 2 years trying to convince people that God's word to him is true. When a mob tried to kill him outside the temple, Acts 21 verses 30 to 31, he explained that Jesus appeared to him, revealed he is the Messiah, and commissioned him to spread his offer of salvation to the Gentiles, Acts 22 verses 3 to 21. Next, he tried to convince the Sadducees in the Sanhedrin that Jesus rose from the dead, Acts 23 verses 1 to 10. During his first trial, he testified to Governor Felix he was innocent of the Sanhedrin's charges. Felix believed him but didn't free him from custody, Acts 24. Governor Festus was not much better, Acts 25 verses 1 to 12. He almost convinced King Agrippa too that Jesus is the Messiah, but Agrippa pulled back at the last minute. At least Agrippa admitted Paul hadn't committed a crime, Acts 26. More recently, Paul tried to convince the captain and pilot of his ship that if they left the shelter of southern Crete, they risked their ship, the cargo, and every life on board. The sailors insisted they needed to go farther west to a better port, but barely got underway before a strong wind blew them into a violent storm that seemed to never end, Acts 27 verses 9 to 20. Now, Paul tries to convince the other 275 passengers and crew members they are going to live. He starts his pep talk with a reminder that he was right, Acts 27 verse 21. This is not for his own ego, but so they'll believe him now when he repeats the message God has given him. He trusts God, even when no one else does, and he will not stop bringing God's message to others. God has spoken, the ship and cargo will be lost, but everyone will live. They still have at least a week to go, but they will live. Verse 26. But we must run aground on some island. The crew members of the ship carrying Paul do not quite know where they are. They know the wind blew them southwest from Crete toward the dangerous sandbars off the shore of Libya. However, the fierce storm has hidden the sun and stars for days and they can't get their bearing, Acts 27 verse 20. They've jettisoned some of their cargo and tackle already, Acts 27 verses 17 to 21. Now, they sense they have changed direction and are pointed northwest, across the southern edge of the Adriatic Sea between Greece and Italy, Acts 27 verse 27. Where, however, is anyone's guess. In fact, they are crossing the Adriatic. They'll come level with the southern point of Sicily before diving southwest again and crashing into a reef off the island of Malta. The ship will be destroyed. The cargo will be thrown overboard. But they'll escape with their lives, Acts 27 verses 38 to 44. Paul is responsible for the fact that everyone lives. Even though he is a prisoner in the custody of the centurion, his status doesn't really matter to him. It doesn't shame him into silence. When he knew the ship's captain and pilot were planning a catastrophic mistake, he boldly told them so, Acts 27 verse 10. When the ship's crew try to abandon the passengers, he warns the centurion to act, Acts 27 verses 30 to 32. When they are about to crash into the reef, he makes everyone eat for strength, Acts 27 verses 33 to 36. Paul does not allow others' perceptions detract from his God-given mission to serve them. Verse 27. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. Paul and Aristarchus are on a ship headed for Rome. There, they will be charged before Caesar's court. Luke is traveling with them. A centurion and his soldiers have been tasked with bringing them from Caesarea Maritima, Acts 27 verse 1. It has been 2 weeks since they left the safety of Crete and sailed into a fierce storm, Acts 27 verses 13 to 15. The good news is that the storm is no longer driving the ship toward the hidden sandbars off the coast of Libya, Acts 27 verse 17. The bad news is that the 276 passengers and crew members haven't eaten in 2 weeks and still can't see anything, Acts 27 verses 21 and 37. The Adriatic Sea is currently the sea between Italy on the west and Croatia, Montenegro, and Albania on the east. In Paul's time, the Adriatic extended into our Ionian Sea between Italy and Greece down to the center of the Mediterranean. Considering their position and location, they would most likely land on Sicily. This is the island often referred to as the toe off Italy's boot-like shape. Instead, they land on the tiny island of Malta, south of Sicily. With no sail, which the sailors lowered, Acts 27 verse 17, modern sailors say the ship would have drifted from Crete west to Malta in 14 days, as described, Acts 27 verse 33. Suspected possibly means the sailors heard breakers above the wind and waves of the storm. Context summary: Acts 27 verses 27 to 32 continues the story of a fierce storm, which has battered Paul's ship for a full 2 weeks. Paul has announced that the ship and cargo will be destroyed, but the people will live. When the sailors realize they're getting close to shore, they plan their escape in the lifeboat. Paul warns the centurion, who orders his soldiers to cut the boat loose. Paul then encourages the crew and passengers to eat for the first time in 14 days before the ship hits the reef and everyone swims for their lives. Verse 28. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. Paul has warned the ship's crew and passengers that the ship and its cargo will be lost, but the people will survive, Acts 27 verse 22. They have been amid a ferocious storm for 2 weeks, only now sensing evidence that land is near, Acts 27 verse 27. It's night, however, and they can't see. They don't know if they're coming on a beach, a harbor, or a reef, so they measure how far down the seabed is. To take a sounding, the sailors lower a rope with a heavy weight on the end. A fathom is about 6 feet, or 2 meters. The first sounding shows the water is relatively deep, but the second is only 3/4 as deep. This means the sea bed is rising quickly. They are rapidly approaching shore. A grain ship, most likely the type of ship they are on, has a deep draft and unseen rocks can tear the hull apart. Because it's night and the clouds cover any available light, the sailors realize they can't go any farther without risking their lives. They lower anchors from the stern so the ship won't go forward, then go to the bow. There, they pretend to set more anchors to keep the boat from spinning. However, they are lowering the lifeboat, intending to escape and abandon their passengers, Acts 27 verses 29 to 30. Fortunately, Paul realizes what they're doing. He tells the centurion, who orders his soldiers to cut the boat free. Paul encourages everyone to eat. After they have their fill, they throw the rest of the wheat into the sea to lighten the ship. When the sun rises, they see a beach. The sailors raise the foresail, untie the rudder, and cut away the anchors to try to run ashore on the beach. They hit a reef, but it's close enough. The swimmers manage under their own power, and the others grab any part of the destroyed ship that can still float. Everyone makes it out alive. Acts 27 verses 31 to 44. Verse 29. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. After 2 weeks of wind, waves, zero visibility, and no appetite, the crew and passengers of the Alexandrian ship are finally close to land. Paul has prophesied that the ship and cargo will be lost, but everyone will survive. The crew apparently takes this to mean maybe they can save the ship and remaining cargo, but they're getting off. Acts 27 verses 21 to 27. The seabed is quickly rising. Acts 27 verse 28. Undoubtedly, rocks and reefs are hiding in the waves and darkness. Morning is still hours away, but the sailors know which direction the land is. They drop anchors at the stern to keep the ship from moving forward. They then make their way to the bow. If they drop anchors at the bow, the tides and waves can't spin the ship around. When daylight comes, they can maneuver the ship to a safe place to run aground. At least, that's what they appear to be doing. Normally, the lifeboat is towed behind the ship. Weeks before, when the storm first caught them, the boat was in danger of filling with water and sinking, so the crew hauled it up and secured it to the bow of the ship. Acts 27 verses 16 to 17. Now, they pretend to drop the anchors at the bow, but they're really lowering the lifeboat, intending to climb in and leave the passengers behind. Paul senses what they're planning, however, and warns the centurion. The centurion orders his soldiers to cut the lifeboat loose, and the sailors have no option but to stay and, when daylight comes, steer the ship to a spot where it will be destroyed, but everyone can escape. Acts 27 verses 30 to 32, 39 to 44. Verse 30. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus are nearing the end of their terrible sea voyage. 2 weeks prior, Paul warned the ship's owner and pilot not to leave fair havens on the southern coast of Crete. Should they leave, they would lose their ship, their cargo, and the lives of their crew and passengers. The crew and the centurion ignored Paul's warning, and nearly as soon as they set sail for a safer harbor, a great winter storm caught them. The horrific winds, Acts 27 verse 14, pushed them around the Mediterranean like a child with a toy boat in a puddle. Acts 27 verses 9 to 15. Since that time, God has answered Paul's prayers and promised no one will die. Acts 27 verses 21 to 26. God's promise requires the action of the people involved, however. The ship has finally neared land, but at night, the crew doesn't know how close they are, what rocks are jutting up, or what reefs hide beneath the waves. The crew dropped the stern anchors to ensure the waves don't push the ship into a hazard, and now they go to drop bow anchors, so the waves don't spin the ship around. At least, that's what they should be doing. Acts 27 verses 27 to 29. Shortly after the storm caught the ship, the waves and wind threatened to swamp and sink the lifeboat. The crew managed to pull it in and secure it to the bow. Acts 27 verses 16 to 17. Now, they're quietly lowering it to the black waters beneath them. If they can climb in before the passengers notice, they have a chance to make it to shore. Paul notices. He warns the centurion, and the soldiers cut the boat away. The sailors are forced to remain on board and wait out the night. Come daylight, they manage to get the ship a little closer to the beach before it hits a reef and breaks apart. Even so, everyone manages to get to shore. Acts 27 verses 31 to 32, 39 to 44. Verse 31. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Julius is a centurion of the Augustan cohort. He and his soldiers are charged with bringing a collection of prisoners from Caesarea Maritima to Rome. At least one of them, Paul, is going because he has appealed his case to Caesar and will face Caesar's court. Despite Paul's prisoner status, Julius respects Paul. When they reached Sidon, Julius allowed Paul's friends there to see to his needs, Acts 27 verses 1-3. Julius, his soldiers, Paul, and Paul's friends Luke and Aristarchus boarded an Alexandrian ship on the southwestern coast of modern-day Turkey to sail across the open waters of the Mediterranean Sea to Rome. Since they boarded, the weather has been uncooperative. Faced with winds from the northwest, they barely managed to make the southern coastline of Crete where the tall mountain ranges protected them. They reached the port city of Fair Havens which, despite its name, does not have a harbor protected enough to spend the winter, Acts 27 verses 5-8. As the ship's owner and pilot discussed what they should do, Paul interjected himself into the conversation. He warned them that if they left Fair Havens they would lose the ship, the cargo, and the lives of everyone on board. The centurion trusted the owner and pilot. The sailors chose to sail a little farther west to Phoenix, which has two good harbors. They had barely set sail before the winds shifted and blew them away from the island and into a typhoon-like storm, Acts 27 verses 9-15. Not long after the ship entered the storm, the crew realized the lifeboat, which typically is towed behind the ship, was in danger of swamping and sinking. They struggled to pull it up to the deck and fastened it to the bow of the ship, Acts 27 verses 16-17. It has now been 14 days of wind, waves, and negligible visibility. Paul has apparently been praying because God has told him although the ship and cargo will be lost everyone will live, Acts 27 verses 21-26. The crew finally realizes they are nearing land, but it is night. They can tell where the land is, but they can't tell if there are rocks or reefs between the ship and the shore. They have lowered the anchors in the stern to keep the ship from going forward. Now they pretend to lower the anchors in the bow to keep the waves from spinning the ship around. Instead, they're lowering the lifeboat to escape, Acts 27 verses 27-30. Julius had sided with the ship's owner and pilot in Fair Havens, but he's done humoring them now. When Paul warns him of the crew's scheme, Julius sends his solders to cut the boat loose and force the crew to stay. Paul encourages everyone to eat, and the crew manages to get the ship close enough to the shore for everyone to get to safety, Acts 27 verses 32-44. This passage suggests some interesting questions about God's promises and human actions. 2 years prior, God had promised Paul he would get to Rome, Acts 23 verse 11. Why did Paul warn that everyone on board would die? Was his warning informed by God's revelation or by his extensive travel experience? He had been shipwrecked 3 times and spent a night adrift, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 25. And how does his second warning, that the ship and cargo would be lost but all lives would be saved, fit with his warning here that if Julius doesn't act, he and the soldiers will die? In the first instance, it appears Paul gave a general warning based on his experience. Surely, he trusted God's promise that he would get to Rome, whether because of the actions of the crew or because of God's supernatural intervention, Acts 8 verse 39. In this second instance, God promised Paul everyone would live, but the fulfillment of his promise involved the actions of the soldiers, which God foreordained. The passengers will die if the crew abandons ship, but God has plans to prevent it. Verse 32. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. Because the ship's owner, pilot, and Julius the centurion ignored Paul's warning, Acts 27 verses 9-10, they have spent the last 14 days in a furious winter storm in the middle of the Mediterranean. They had no way to determine where they are and no way to control their movement. Finally, it appears they are near land. But what kind of land? An island? Rocks that jut out from the water? Reefs that hide just beneath the surface? The crew has laid anchor so the ship, hopefully, can't go any closer to the shore, but now Paul warns the centurion that the sailors are trying to escape in the lifeboat. If they do, the passengers will not survive. Julius has ignored Paul's warnings long enough. He orders his soldiers to cut away the lifeboat so the crew can't escape into the dark night. The text doesn't say why they thought it best to cut away the boat instead of hauling it back up, but they've gone without food and likely good sleep for 14 days, guarding it would take a lot of energy. Now that the crew and passengers are united again, Paul encourages them to eat. Everyone is exhausted with fear. He knows they still need to get to shore, and it won't be easy. He takes bread, thanks God for it, and passes it around. Everyone feels slightly better and tosses the rest of the cargo overboard in hopes they can get closer to land. Acts 27 verses 33 to 38. When morning comes, the sailors see a beach and steer toward it. Unfortunately, the deep draft of the ship hits a reef and holds fast. The crew swims for it. The soldiers are hesitant. It's their heads if they lose a prisoner, and it would be easier to kill them now. Julius values Paul too much. He orders his soldiers to stand down, and the passengers make it to shore floating on the bits of the broken-up ship that still float. Acts 27 verses 39 to 44. Verse 33. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing." Paul is prisoner being transported to Rome on an Alexandrian ship, finally reaching the end of a 2-week voyage through a typhoon-grade storm in the Mediterranean. The ship has dodged the hidden sandbars off the coast of Libya and managed not to swamp or capsize, but the waves and wind are so great no one has eaten for 2 weeks. The Greek for "in suspense" means watching to see how this will end. They've been watching, with no hope of survival for over a week. Acts 27 verse 20. Everyone's exhausted with fear, and they still need to make it to shore, so Paul takes charge. It's night. They don't know exactly where they are. They don't know what stands between them and land. They don't know if there's a good place to bring the ship in closer, perhaps even a beach. But Paul assures them that no one will die. Everyone will make it. Acts 27 verse 22. First, however, they need to eat. Even if they do make it to within swimming distance of the island, they'll need energy to make it the last few yards. Paul either finds bread or quickly makes some from the wheat the ship is transporting. He prays over it, breaks it, and eats it. The passengers and crew are encouraged and take some as well. Then they throw the wheat into the sea to try to raise the ship above potential hazards. Acts 27 verses 34 to 38. Paul will face one more obstacle before he can reach dry land. The soldiers don't want any of the prisoners to escape. In fact, they'd rather kill them than risk it. Julius, the centurion who is guarding Paul and the other prisoners, has always been kind to Paul and has learned to trust him. Acts 27 verse 3. He controls his soldiers, and everyone makes it to the island alive. Acts 27 verses 42 to 44. Context summary: Acts 27 verses 33 to 38 places Paul at the center of the action once again. His ship has been storm-tossed and lost for 2 weeks. The 276 total passengers have finally reached land, but don't know what rocks or reefs are between them and safety. The centurion has prevented the crew's escape attempt. Acts 27 verses 27 to 32. Now, Paul brings everyone together to do something they haven't been able to in 14 days, eat. They share bread and jettison the remaining cargo. Once dawn breaks, the crew sails the ship closer to land, but the ship gets hung up on a reef. Eventually, however, everyone makes it to shore. Acts 27 verses 39 to 44. Verse 34. Therefore I urge you to take some food. For it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. Paul is a prisoner on a ship under the custody of Julius, a centurion. He is on the way to face Caesar's court in Rome. For 2 weeks a fierce winter storm has buffeted the ship, but God has promised Paul no one on board will die, even as the ship and its cargo will be lost. Acts 27 verses 22 to 24. The ship has finally reached an island, and as the crew searches for a good place to land, they look out for hidden rocks and reefs. God has promised everyone will live, but not that he'll miraculously deliver them. People still need to act. Paul made the first move when the crew lowered the lifeboat and attempted to abandon the passengers. He told the centurion he and the soldiers would not survive if the crew left. The soldiers cut the boat free, and the crew had to stay. Acts 27 verses 30 to 32. Now, Paul encourages everyone to eat. Most likely, the ship is carrying grain from Alexandria, Egypt, to Rome. Grain ships are large, with a deep draft, the distance below the water's surface which the boat's hull rides. Undoubtedly, this massive vessel will run aground before it reaches land. As expected, the ship strikes a reef, forcing everyone to swim or paddle on the flotsam from the wreck. They haven't eaten in 2 weeks and need energy. Acts 27 verse 41. When the ship runs aground, the centurion will have to act. If any prisoners escape, the soldiers could be executed. They'd prefer to execute the prisoners on board. The centurion steps in and stops their plans. Paul has already done so much for them, the centurion will make sure he gets to safety. Acts 27 verses 42 to 44. The way Paul feeds the 276 passengers and crew is reminiscent of how Jesus fed thousands, though there's no sign of supernatural multiplication. He simply takes bread, praises God for it, and breaks it, in this context, likely meaning he distributed it to others. For the first time in 2 weeks, they have hope. Verse 35. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all he broke it and began to eat. For the first time in 2 weeks, the ship charged to bring wheat from Alexandria to Rome is still enough that those on board can make bread. They have survived fierce winter winds and waves that drove them from Crete, southwest to the dangerous waters around Libya, and back northwest to an island they can barely see in the light of the rising sun. Acts 27 verses 14 to 17, 28:1. Finally, the waters are calm enough that they can eat something, and Paul encourages them to do so. The way Paul presents the bread evokes the Lord's Supper. Luke and Aristarchus are with them, and it's possible there are other Christians on board. Some scholars think Paul is officiating communion and the rest of the passengers and crew just take their example to eat something. The text, however, suggests Paul is encouraging everyone to eat. They have reached an island, but they still have work to do. The crew dumps the grain to raise the hull as far as possible above the sea bottom. Even doing so, between the ship and the beach is a hidden reef that will soon ground the ship, Acts 27 verse 41, and everyone will have to either swim to shore or ride bits and pieces of the ship that can still float. They need energy to make the last few yards. Verse 36. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. A few weeks before, Paul faced the new governor Festus in a court in Caesarea Maritima. There, the Sanhedrin presented charges so blatantly false that even Festus, who knew nothing about Judaism or Jews, could see how unfounded they were. Not wishing to irritate the Jewish leaders, Festus tried to satisfy both sides. When Paul realized Festus would not release him, he appealed his case to Caesar, Acts 25 verses 6 to 12. Festus placed him, Aristarchus, and other prisoners under the custody of the centurion Julius and his soldiers. Luke is accompanying them, Acts 27 verse 1. The sea voyage has not been easy. After spending 2 weeks holding on for dear life to a ship in the clutches of a Mediterranean winter storm, the crew and passengers are exhausted. The ship has finally reached an island, the sun is slowly rising. They can't yet see what lies between the ship and the shore, but the anchors are set and at last they have some calm. God has promised Paul that everyone will live, but until now it seems the crew and passengers weren't convinced, Acts 27 verses 22 to 25. Paul knows the ship and cargo will be lost. It's a large ship that can't just ride up onto the beach, they will run aground at some point, and the people will have to swim or paddle to shore. They need energy. As if remembering how to eat, the passengers and crew follow Paul's example and take some bread. This gives them the strength they need to jettison the remainder of the cargo and lighten the ship as much as they can. When the sun rises, they find a bay with a beach. Hoping to run the ship onto the land, the crew draws up the anchors, raises the sails for the first time since the storm started, and unlashes the rudder. The ship approaches the shore but hits an underground reef and sticks fast. As the surf smashes against the already battered hull, the passengers and crew jump ship. The soldiers realize how difficult it will be to keep track of all the prisoners and plan to kill them on board, but the centurion stops them. It's because of Paul they're even alive. The centurion can trust Paul not to escape, Acts 27 verses 39 to 44. Verse 37. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus are on an Alexandrian ship that is about to wreck off the coast of the island of Malta, south of Sicily, Acts 27 verse 1, 28:1. Paul and Aristarchus are prisoners in the custody of Julius, a centurion, and Julius's soldiers. Right after the ship runs aground on a reef, the soldiers will try to kill all the prisoners, but Julius will stop them, Acts 27 verses 42 to 44. Also on board are the sailors who, hours before, tried to escape in the lifeboat and leave the passengers to their own fate. Julius also stopped them, Acts 27 verses 30 to 32. Filling out the remaining castaways are Luke and the rest of the passengers. They have been on the ship, in a storm, for 14 days, Acts 27 verse 33. The clouds have covered the sun and stars, so they're not sure where they are, Acts 27 verse 20. The winds have been too strong, so they lowered the sails, Acts 27 verse 17. The waves are so intense they lashed the rudder. Despite Paul's assurances that his God has promised to save every life, Acts 27 verses 22 to 25, it seems no one really believes him. They lost hope days ago, Acts 27 verse 20. Surrounded by sailors who don't care if the passengers die and soldiers who don't mind killing the prisoners, faced with a cold and dangerous swim to shore, Paul does something otherwise absurd. He invites everyone to breakfast. No one has eaten in 2 weeks. They'll need their strength to survive. So, Paul bakes or finds some bread, gives thanks to God, and starts eating. At first, the people just stare at him. Then they take the bread he offers, Acts 27 verses 33 to 36. For now, it's enough. The Codex Vaticanus is a copy of the Bible found in the Vatican Library. It gives the number as, about 76 people, but it's unclear if the crew and/or soldiers are included. The ship that took Josephus to Italy carried 600 people. A large grain ship, like this ship most likely was about 180 feet long, or 55 meters, about the size of a modern seafaring tugboat. Verse 38. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. An Alexandrian ship headed for Rome carries Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus, Acts 27 verse 1. Paul and Aristarchus are prisoners under the authority of the centurion Julius, Colossians 4 verse 10. The ship has been in the middle of a fierce winter storm for 2 weeks, so violent, neither the crew nor the passengers have eaten anything. On the 14th night, the sailors realize they are near land. They manage to drop the anchors at the stern to keep the ship from going forward and presumably at the bow to keep the waves from turning them about. In the relative calm, Paul encourages everyone to eat. They still need to swim to shore, and they need the energy, Acts 27 verses 27 to 36. A couple of days after the ship entered the storm, the crew lowered the sails. The next day, they jettisoned some of the cargo, and the day after that, they threw the tackle overboard, Acts 27 verses 17 to 19. Grain ships, what this vessel most likely is, are large and have a significant draft. They can be 180 feet by 50 feet, or 55 by 15 meters, and almost as far from the deck to the bottom of the hold as they are wide. Islands are often surrounded by rocks and hidden reefs. The crew needs to raise the boat as high as they can, so they throw out the rest of the cargo. It's not enough. As the sun rises, the crew finds a bay with a beach. Hoping to run aground as close to the beach as possible, they raise the foresail and allow the wind to drive them in. Instead, they strike a reef some distance away. The bow is stuck fast and the surf tears apart the already battered stern. Those who can, swim to shore; those who can't swim find some piece of flotsam to grab onto and kick their way in. Finally, they all make it. Acts 27 verses 39 to 44. Verse 39. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned if possible to run the ship ashore. Paul appealed his case to a higher court in Rome only because governors in Caesarea Maritima refused to admit he was innocent. They ignored clear evidence that the Sanhedrin's charges were false and gave no hint they would ever release him. Acts 25 verses 6 to 12. Paul most likely didn't think that going to Rome would involve 2 weeks in a typhoon, a shipwreck on a tiny island, and soldiers who would rather see their prisoners executed than risk them escaping. The ship is anchored off an island. The crew has already tried to escape in the lifeboat, but Paul and the centurion forced them to stay. Acts 27 verses 30 to 32. Now, as the sun rises, the crew sees a convenient beach. They cut away the anchors, raise the foresail, and try to carefully maneuver into the harbor. This trip, however, shows no signs of easing, even in its last moments. The ship hits an underwater reef and holds fast. The surf pounds the aft section of the hull, tearing it apart. The soldiers plan to kill the prisoners, most likely because their lives will be forfeit if any escape. Julius the centurion has great respect for Paul and stops their swords. Those who can swim, jump in the cold water. Those who can't swim grab onto planks and other bits of the ship that still float. Eventually, everyone makes it safely to shore. Acts 27 verses 40 to 44. They soon learn the island is Malta, just south of Sicily. Everyone will wait out the winter there and, 3 months later, a ship will take them to Italy. Acts 28 verses 1 and 11. For now, they're just grateful to be on land. Context summary: Acts 27 verses 39 to 44 describes dawn breaking as Paul's ship finally succumbs to the sea and wrecks. The 276 crew members and passengers can see the island they've reached. But it's still a dangerous trek to the shore. Paul and the other prisoners face a hidden reef, strong surf, and murderous Roman soldiers. They finally make it to land, where it promptly starts raining. Fortunately, the locals are friendly and helpful, and after another 3 months, Paul finally makes it to Rome. Acts 28. Verse 40. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind they made for the beach. Paul and Aristarchus are prisoners on a ship from Alexandria on their way to Rome. Luke is with them. Acts 27 verse 1. Their trip has been detoured by a fierce winter storm that hid the sun and stars for 2 weeks. Acts 27 verses 20 and 27. Finally, they have reached an island, but no one knows where they are. During the night, the crew dropped anchor, fore and aft, so the ship points toward the island and won't spin with the tides. They've apparently also tied down the rudder to keep the ship pointed inland. The crew dropped the sails shortly after they entered the storm. They also jettisoned the cargo, the wheat, and the ship's tackle. Acts 27 verses 17 to 19, 38. Now they cut away the anchors, trying to get the deep-drafted ship as high above the water, and hidden reefs, as they can. They also free the rudder so they can steer into the bay, and raise the foresail, hoping the wind will gently drive them onto the beach. It's enough to get them within swimming distance of the beach. The bow hits a reef. The waves batter the stern and tear it apart. But Paul's worries aren't over, yet. The soldiers are inclined to kill the prisoners, so they won't escape. Fortunately, the centurion stops them, Acts 27 verses 41 to 43. As God promised Paul, everyone makes it to shore, worse for wear, but alive, Acts 27 verses 22 to 25. Verse 41. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The skill of the crew helped their ship survive a storm so fierce they didn't see sun or stars for 14 days. The grace of God directed the wind so they avoided the dangerous sandbars off the coast of Libya. Rather, the weather turned the ship toward Rome, their ultimate destination. Now, they've reached an island with a port and a beach. If they can reach the beach, they can ground the ship and get to land with minimal struggle. They've already tossed the tackle, cargo, and grain overboard. Now they cut away the anchors, loose the rudder, and raise the foresail to gently make their way to the beach, Acts 27 verses 17 to 19, 20, 29, 33, 38, 40. That goal will not be attained. Under the water, above the beam of the ship, lies a reef of mud and tenacious clay that grabs the bow and holds it fast. The ship's battered hull has been held together with ropes and cable for 2 weeks, and it's reached the end of its strength. The surf pounds the stern, breaking the ship apart. The situation could be worse. The bow is intact, and the crew and passengers can make their way to the water, then swim or ride on flotsam to shore. The soldiers guarding the prisoners realize their dilemma. They can't guard their charges in the water. If they lose a prisoner, their lives could be forfeit. So, they decide to kill the prisoners, Acts 27 verse 42. Their centurion, however, won't let them. One of the prisoners is Paul, he who predicted the storm, the lost ship and cargo, and promised no one would die. He even warned the soldiers when the crew tried to leave on the lifeboat, Acts 27:1, 9 to 10, 22, 30 to 31. Paul said everyone would reach safety. The centurion is going to make sure that happens. Verse 42. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. Several weeks prior, Paul stood in Caesarea Maritima before Festus, the new governor. There, he heard the Sanhedrin reintroduce unfounded charges they hoped would lead to Paul's execution. Barring that, Paul's enemies hoped he'd be transferred to Jerusalem so they could murder him along the way. When Paul realized Festus was more concerned with pleasing the Sanhedrin than justice, he berated the governor for not doing his job and appealed his case to Caesar. Festus had no choice but to agree, Acts 25 verses 1 to 12. Now, Paul is with a group of fellow prisoners on the quickly disintegrating remains of an Alexandrian ship, likely transporting grain to Rome. The vessel has only just survived a 2-week typhoon. The bow is stuck in a muddy clay reef. The waves are tearing apart the stern. The beach is just a swim away, Acts 27 verses 6 and 33, 41. Between Paul and land, however, is a cadre of soldiers who know they will likely be executed if any prisoner escapes. If the ship had reached the beach, they could have guarded the prisoners as they climbed down the hull. As it is, they can't keep everyone under tight control while they're swimming and paddling and kicking for the shore. So, they resolve to kill them, instead. Fortunately, their centurion, Julius, has always liked Paul and has grown to respect him greatly over the previous 2 weeks, Acts 27:3, 31 to 32. He calls the soldiers off and orders as orderly an evacuation as possible. Everyone makes it to shore, and presumably no prisoners escape, Acts 27 verses 43 to 44. Verse 43. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land. Perhaps a month before, Julius, a centurion of the Augustan cohort, received orders to take prisoners from Caesarea Maritima to Rome. He loaded them on a coastal vessel that brought them to Myra, a port in southwest modern-day Turkey. Then, they boarded an Alexandrian ship headed to Rome, Acts 27 verses 1-6. He and his soldiers likely gained a second commission as guards for the cargo. After meeting contrary winds, the ship found shelter at Fair Havens, a port on the southern coast of Crete. One of the prisoners, Paul, warned the crew that if they left Fair Havens they would lose the ship, the cargo, and their lives. The ship's owner and pilot agreed they needed to find a safe harbor to spend the winter. But the port at Fair Havens was not sufficient. Slightly farther west, the town of Phoenix had two harbors perfectly sheltered from the coming storms, Acts 27 verses 8-10, 12. Julius sided with the owner and pilot, Acts 27 verse 11. A few hours after they set sail, the wind shifted. The passengers and crew held on for dear life as a typhoon-grade storm tossed them about, hid the stars and sun, and made it impossible to even eat. Long after everyone had lost hope of rescue, Paul stood up again. He proclaimed that his God promised he would get to Rome. Further, the Lord would let everyone else on the ship live, as well. This time, Julius listened to Paul, Acts 27 verses 13-25. 2 weeks after they entered the storm, the sailors realized they were coming fast upon an island. It was too dark to bring the ship in close. The crew lowered the aft anchors to stop the ship's movement. Then they went to the front of the ship. There, they should have been lowering the 4 anchors to keep the waves from spinning the ship around. At least, that is what Julius thought they were doing. Paul pointed out they had lowered the lifeboat and were preparing to climb in. Julius ordered the soldiers to cut the lines, Acts 27 verses 27-32. The next morning, Paul encouraged everyone to eat. This gave them enough energy to throw the remaining grain overboard to raise the ship, and to sail into the nearby harbor, hoping to run aground on the beach. Instead, the bow is now stuck on a clay reef and the waves are tearing apart the stern. The soldiers have a problem. If they'd landed the ship on the beach, they could have monitored the prisoners to make sure no one escaped. As things stand, the ship is still quite a ways from the shore, and they can't guard everyone. But they can't lose any prisoners either, or else they could be executed. They decide to just kill the prisoners, instead, Acts 27 verses 33-42. They didn't account for their centurion. He will not let Paul die. He orders the soldiers to stand down and the prisoners to swim if they can. The rest will make their way on the broken-off bits of the ship that still float. Everyone will make it out alive, Acts 27 verse 44. Verse 44. And the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. A couple of days after the Roman tribune in Jerusalem arrested Paul for becoming a human punching bag, Acts 21 verses 27-36, Jesus sent Paul a message, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome," Acts 23 verse 11. Less than a week later, the tribune sent his prisoner away to the governor in Caesarea Maritima because the Sanhedrin had plotted to assassinate Paul, Acts 23 verses 12-35. Governor Felix knew their charges were false, yet he kept Paul under house arrest for 2 years, Acts 24 verses 22-27. When Festus took Felix's place, he, too, wanted to please the Sanhedrin. He asked Paul to move the trial to Jerusalem, probably not knowing the Sanhedrin wanted another chance to kill him. Paul berated Festus for not doing his job and appealed his case to Caesar, Acts 25 verses 2-3, 9-12. Paul, fellow prisoner Aristarchus, Colossians 4 verse 10, and Luke boarded a ship bound for a major port in modern-day Turkey where they could catch a seafaring ship to Rome. Since then, they have endured a 2-week typhoon, sailors who tried to abandon their ship and passengers to a dangerous coast, and murderous soldiers. Along the way, Paul apparently prayed for the lives of the crew and passengers. God promised everyone would make landfall alive, Acts 27 verses 1-43. Now, they finally do. On pieces of the ship means, on things from the ship, which may include the stronger swimmers helping to drag along weaker persons. They have landed on the small island of Malta, just south of Sicily. Soon, the weather will turn rainy and cold, and Paul will be bitten by a viper. But the people are kind, and after he heals the father of the local leader, the people will turn generous. The shipwreck survivors will spend 3 months on the island before catching another ship to Italy. Paul will finally reach Rome. He will spend another 2 years under house arrest, and the Jews will largely ignore him, but he will write the prison epistles and even bring Jesus' offer of forgiveness to Caesar's servants, Acts 28. It's not the way Paul wanted to get to Rome, and it's not the way he wanted to live in Rome, but it's enough. End of chapter 27. Please note: the material use in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.